Hello, my name is Nicola Agricola, and I am a storyteller, and I'm going to tell you some Roman stories. The Romans believed in many gods. The god of war, Mars, the god of the sun, Apollo, and they even had a god of parties called Bacchus. And Bacchus would drink wine, and he'd had female followers called Maenads. And this story is about the god Bacchus. And it happens, as all good stories do, with a once upon a time, long, long ago, in a land that we now call Turkey, there was a king called Midas. And King Midas, he loved three things above all others. He loved his daughter. He loved his rose garden, which was one of the finest rose gardens in all the world. And he loved gold. But unfortunately, King Midas didn't have much gold because his land was very poor. Now one day, and it was a beautiful sunny day, King Midas awoke and he went into his rose garden to sniff the flowers. And as he bent down to sniff a flower, he stumbled across a fat, beardy old man sleeping in his rose garden. And this old man, he was snoring his head off. King Midas looked at the old man. He had the ears and the tail of a horse. This was a satyr, a servant of the gods. Well, King Midas coughed politely, awaking the old man, who sat up and he rubbed his head and he introduced himself to King Midas as Silenus, the teacher of Bacchus, the god of wine. Bacchus and his followers had been partying, and Silenus had smelt the beautiful roses. He'd wandered off and fallen asleep, and they'd left him there. Well, King Midas invited Silenus back to his palace, and for 10 days and 10 nights, Silenus entertained the court with wonderful tales of a race of giants that lived beyond the North Pole, tales of whirlpools and sea monsters, tales of a magical tree that bore golden apples, and if you ate one of those apples, you would be granted eternal life. Except nobody knew where that tree was, and it was guarded by a 100-headed dragon. He told the tale of a very proud young woman called Arachne, who was a wonderful weaver, so proud she believed she was better than the gods themselves. And when she challenged the gods to a spinning competition, she was transformed from a beautiful young girl into a spider that would spin silk. And he told the tale of how the bee got its sting. But after 10 days and 10 nights, he had drunk all the wine, he had eaten all the food, and he wanted to go back to see Bacchus. So King Midas, determined to get rid of Silenus, who had eaten everything in the palace, agreed to take Silenus to Bacchus. And at that time of year, Bacchus would be deep in the south of the country, teaching people to grow vines and create wonderful wine. And so they made the long and hot journey. They went down the lane, across fields, across streams, up hills, until eventually Silenus saw Bacchus and his female followers, the Maenads, dancing wildly in the field. When Bacchus saw Silenus, he was absolutely delighted. He gave his friend a huge hug and said, "Oh, Silenus, wine was sour, music was flat, the dances failed without you." And he looked to King Midas and he said to Midas, "Anything you want, anything you want, King Midas, you can have, because you brought my pal back. Anything, said King Midas. Well, whatever I touch turns to gold. Bacchus looked at King Midas. You sure about that? Yes, whatever I touch turns to gold. Right, said Bacchus. Go home, bathe in wine, and the next morning whatever you touch will turn to gold. So King Midas, he had to buy wine because Silenus had drunk all the wine. He bought the wine and he returned to his palace. Across the hills and the valleys and the streams and down the dusty roads, eventually he returned. And that night he bathed in wine. And maybe it was the fumes of the wine, but he had a really good sleep. And the next morning he awoke, and it was a beautiful day. And he left his bedchamber and he went to his rose garden to sniff his roses. And he bent to touch a flower. It turned to gold. He touched another flower and another flower. I'm rich, shouted King Midas. And he was jumping up and down in his nightshirt when his daughter came out of the palace. Father, what are you doing? And he hugged his daughter. We're rich. His daughter turned to gold. The dog came jumping towards King Midas, and he bent down to pat the dog, and the dog turned to gold. The cat, hearing the commotion, wound his tail around King Midas's leg, turned to gold. King Midas looked, I'll deal with that later. I'm hungry. He went into his chamber, where his breakfast was prepared for him, bacon and eggs, and the finest coffee in all the land, and some orange juice. He tried to eat the bacon, turned to gold. The egg to gold. The coffee, the orange juice. The servants were backing away from King Midas, and he was really beginning to regret his choice of gift. King Midas spent 3 days with no food and no water, and when he lay down on his bed, it turned to gold. He could not sleep. On the 3rd night, he tossed and turned. He had a dream, a terrible dream, and Bacchus came to him in that dream, and Bacchus said, King Midas, you foolish man. It is a good job I love Silenus so, and he says that you were so kind to him. Go to the river, bathe in the river, and the next morning touch everything that was gold, and it will be returned to its normal state. So the next morning, King Midas went down to the river Pactolus. He was tired, he was weary, he was hungry, and he bathed in the river. And he went back to his palace. He touched his daughter, and she transformed back into herself. He touched his dog, and the dog began to bark, delighted to see the king. He touched the cat, and the cat marched off, giving King Midas a withering look. He touched the flowers. He went into the palace, and he touched the bacon and the egg and the coffee and the tea that had never tasted so good. And he never again demanded gold. And if you go to the river Pactolus to this day, and you look into the river, you can see flecks of gold where King Midas lost his golden touch. Thank you for hearing my stories. And there will be more stories and tales of Rome on February the 18th at the Trimontium Museum.